You think the best recipes in American history are the ones that survived? Think again. Some dishes were so good, so tied to real life and real kitchens, that when the world moved on, they vanished without a trace. Here are 60 recipes that were too good, so they made them disappear. Mashed potato cakes were the genius of leftovers reborn. Cold mashed potatoes mixed with flour, salt, and a touch of fat, then shaped into patties and fried until crisp on the edges. They sizzled in the pan, transforming yesterday's scraps into today's comfort. The golden crust cracked to reveal soft, creamy centers, a texture so familiar it could quiet any hunger. Sometimes bits of onion or herbs were added, sometimes just salt and pepper, but the flavor was always satisfying. In kitchens where every crumb mattered, nothing was ever wasted, and mashed potato cakes proved that thrift could still be delicious. Served for breakfast or dinner, they filled stomachs and hearts alike. They reminded families that creativity was their greatest tool and that flavor could be found even in scarcity. These simple cakes were the taste of survival done right, humble, resourceful, and full of warmth. Chestnut stuffing made from fresh chestnuts was the Christmas side dish that required patience, but delivered unmatched flavor and texture. Fresh chestnuts were scored with an axe, roasted until the shells split, then peeled while still hot to remove both outer shell and inner skin. The tender nuts were chopped and mixed with bread cubes, sautéed celery and onions, sage, butter, and broth, creating stuffing that was simultaneously hearty and delicate. The chestnuts added sweetness and meaty texture that no other ingredient could replicate, transforming ordinary stuffing into something genuinely special. The preparation was labor-intensive, with burns from hot shells considered inevitable, but the result justified the effort. In European and American traditions, chestnut stuffing represented Christmas luxury and the proper way to honor roasted birds. Street vendors sold roasted chestnuts throughout winter, making them associated with holiday celebration and cold weather comfort. Modern versions using canned chestnuts miss the subtle char and sweetness of fresh roasted nuts. This stuffing once defined Christmas dinner sophistication, proving that some traditions required genuine work and dedication. Cornbread dressing with sage was the backbone of Southern Thanksgivings. Crumbled cornbread mixed with onions, celery, eggs, and fragrant sage baked into something more sacred than side dish. It was soft, yet firm, moist, yet golden, every bite alive with the warmth of herbs and butter. No boxed mix could ever compare. It came from cast iron, from hands that had known labor and grace in equal measure. The scent of sage drifted through the house, calling everyone to the table before the bell even rang. Each forkful tasted of time, of love passed through generations. It was a recipe you could not rush. It asked for attention, and it gave back tenfold in comfort. Some cooks added a splash of broth from the turkey pan. Others stirred in crumbled biscuits or a handful of chopped eggs, each family leaving its own signature on the sacred dish. It was a meal that gathered memories as easily as it gathered people. The sound of spoons scraping the pan was its own kind of blessing. Cornbread dressing was more than food. It was a story baked into every crumb, written by grandmothers who knew that the heart of Thanksgiving was found in the humblest pan. Butter and sugar sandwiches were the childhood candy of the broke and content. 2 slices of white bread, a spread of butter, and a sprinkle of sugar. That was dessert. Kids came home from school hungry, opened the pantry, and made these without asking. Sometimes the butter wasn't real butter, but margarine, slick and sweet just the same. It wasn't fancy, but when you bit into it, the crunch of sugar met the softness of bread in the most perfect way. It was cheap joy in the shape of a sandwich, a moment of sweetness when life was rough around the edges. Parents made them too, not just for kids, but for themselves, because a bite of that sugar and butter sandwich tasted like nostalgia. It reminded them that even when the world felt out of reach, they still had bread, sweetness, and a reason to smile. Vegetable scrap stew was the true emblem of Depression-era ingenuity. Nothing was wasted, not a single peel or stem. Cooks gathered whatever remained from the week's meals: carrot tops, onion skins, cabbage cores, and let them simmer into a hearty broth. Each batch was unique, depending on what the garden or the pantry had left to give. Sometimes it was thick and earthy, sometimes thin and tangy, but always nourishing. It taught a quiet lesson that resourcefulness was its own kind of abundance. Housewives prided themselves on creating flavor from what others might throw away. When rationing came during wartime, this dish returned again, proof that history's hardest lessons were never truly forgotten. Even children learned the value of waste not, want not, as they watched their mothers turn scraps into sustenance. Vegetable scrap stew was more than food. It was resilience in a pot, a living memory of how families survived by turning nothing into something worth sharing. Parsnip fritters turned humble root vegetables into crispy winter treats, satisfied cravings for something beyond boiled or mashed. Parsnips stored in root cellars were grated raw, mixed with egg and flour, seasoned with salt and pepper, and fried in lard until golden brown. The exterior crisped while the interior stayed tender, the parsnip's natural sweetness caramelizing slightly. These fritters appeared at winter breakfasts and suppers, served alongside meat or eggs. In farmhouses where potatoes dominated winter meals, parsnips provided welcome variety, their sweeter flavor making them almost dessert-like. Children who refused plain boiled parsnips would eat these eagerly, the crispy coating making vegetables appealing. The frying fat added richness and calories essential for maintaining body heat during outdoor work. Mothers made large batches, feeding families of 8 or more from a single grating session. The tradition showed how preparation method could transform perception as nutritious food delicious. Parsnip fritters were economical, using vegetables that grew easily and stored well. Modern grocery stores offer convenience but lost connection to seasons, to foresight, to the satisfaction of eating food prepared months before through family effort. Boiled Christmas pudding wrapped in cheesecloth was the centerpiece dessert that required 3 hours of steaming and months of aging. Families mixed dried fruits, breadcrumbs, suet, eggs, molasses, and brandy into a dense batter that was packed into pudding basins or wrapped tightly in cloth, then boiled in massive pots on Christmas morning. The smell of spices and fruit filled entire houses as the pudding steamed, transforming into something dark, moist, and incredibly rich. When finally unwrapped and turned out onto plates, the pudding was doused with more brandy and set aflame, arriving at the table wreathed in blue fire. The texture was dense and almost cake-like, studded with fruits that had plumped during cooking and infused with deep spice and alcohol flavors. In British and American households through the mid-20th century, Christmas pudding represented the height of holiday tradition, something prepared with ceremony and served with pride. Hidden coins and charms were often baked inside for luck. Today's instant versions miss the ritual entirely. Mashed turnips with butter were the humble cousins to mashed potatoes, a little sharper, a little braver. Peeled and boiled until soft, then mashed with butter, salt, and a touch of cream, they carried a faint peppery bite that made the tongue take notice. The scent was earthy, honest, and full of history. Grandmothers served them as a balancing act, a reminder that not all comfort needed to be mild. Turnips were cheap, but they tasted like care, warm, soft, and grounded. When mixed half and half with potatoes, they turned gentler, but on their own they stood proud. Every spoonful felt like old wisdom, the kind that valued flavor born from work. They spoke of lean years and rich gratitude, of tables that fed more mouths than money should allow. And somehow, in their simplicity, mashed turnips held a power far greater than their cost. They carried pride. Cold spaghetti sandwiches were the proud invention of leftovers and late nights. You'd open the fridge, see a bowl of yesterday's spaghetti, and realize that bread was the only thing left. So you'd scoop the cold noodles right onto the bread, fold it over, and take a bite. It was messy, chewy, and surprisingly satisfying. The sauce soaked into the bread, turning it into something that didn't need reheating or plating. It became a classic among factory workers, college kids, and tired parents who didn't have the energy to reheat a pan. It might have looked ridiculous, but it worked. It was dinner without dishes. Cold spaghetti sandwiches were proof that comfort food doesn't have to make sense. It just has to make you full. Eggless, sugarless cake was proof that sweetness didn't need luxury. It just needed heart. Born from wartime and depression kitchens, it relied on ingenuity instead of ingredients. Housewives used mashed fruit, molasses or syrup for sweetness, and vinegar or baking soda to keep it light. It baked up fragrant and soft, the scent of cinnamon and cloves filling the room with warmth even when sugar and eggs were nowhere to be found. Each slice carried the memory of a time when creativity was the only currency that mattered. It was often shared at church socials or brought to neighbors who were struggling too, a gift that spoke of kindness as much as thrift. Even children who didn't understand rationing smiled at its humble sweetness. Eggless, sugarless cake was survival turned celebratory, the kind of dessert that reminded families that joy was still possible even when the pantry shelves were nearly bare. Beef heart braised with vegetables turned organ meat into tender winter dinner, economical and nourishing. The heart was cleaned, trimmed, and stuffed with bread and herb dressing, then braised for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes. The long cooking made the dense muscle tender, while stuffing absorbed meat juices and vegetable flavors. Farmhouse families served this at Sunday dinners, the large heart feeding 8 or more people from meat that cost little. In communities that practiced nose-to-tail eating, beef heart represented normal food rather than poverty meal. Nose-to-tail eating wasn't philosophical choice, but practical necessity. Yet the resulting dishes proved that skillful cooking honored animals by using everything they provided to sustain human families through winter. Pfeffernusse cookies aged in tins were the German Christmas tradition that improved with time and filled homes with spice aromas. The dough combined flour, honey, molasses, and an elaborate spice blend of cinnamon, cloves, cardamom, white pepper, and anise, creating something intensely flavored and slightly mysterious. Small balls were formed and baked until firm, then rolled in powdered sugar while still warm. Fresh from the oven, they were hard and almost inedible, but stored in airtight tins for weeks. They softened into tender, chewy cookies that released complex spice flavors with every bite. German immigrant families brought this tradition to America, baking Pfeffernusse in November and storing them until Christmas when they reached perfect texture. The cookies represented patience and planning, showing that some things improved when given time. Children looked forward to them despite their unusual spiciness, learning to appreciate flavors beyond simple sweetness. Today they appear mainly in specialty bakeries, but they once filled cookie tins across German-American households every December. Homemade Parker house rolls were softness made visible, buttery crescents that could make a whole kitchen smell like hope. The dough was rich with milk and yeast, kneaded until smooth and elastic, then left to rise under a clean towel while conversation hummed in the background. Each roll was folded gently, brushed with melted butter, and baked until golden brown. The tops shone like sunlight on fresh wood. When they came out of the oven, steam curled into the air. Sweet, warm, and comforting as a hug. Grandmothers guarded their recipes, measuring by feel, trusting their hands more than any written page. A basket of these rolls sat on every table, their scent mingling with the turkey and gravy, inviting everyone to reach in before grace was said. They were the quiet foundation of the meal, soft enough to hold memory and strong enough to bind a family together. Canned milk corn chowder was a soup that hugged you from the inside. You'd open a can of evaporated milk, pour it into a pot, add a few handfuls of frozen corn and some instant potato flakes, and let it all come together over a low flame. The result was thick, creamy, and comforting, the kind of meal that tasted richer than your wallet said it should. It warmed you up fast and made you feel like you had something special on the stove. This was a dinner for cold nights, small paychecks, and big appetites. Even without bacon or cream, it had depth, thanks to the sweet corn and that canned milk tang. Served with a few crackers or a slice of bread, it made a full meal out of almost nothing. Canned milk corn chowder wasn't just food. It was a reminder that with a pot, a can, and a little patience, you could turn scarcity into comfort. Cornmeal pancakes were the morning's promise that even in lean times, there could still be sweetness. Made from cornmeal, water, and a spoon of lard or fat saved from dinner, they came together quickly on a hot griddle. Their edges crisped to gold, their centers soft and grainy, and for a few moments the kitchen felt rich again. Some families drizzled them with syrup or molasses if they had any. Others ate them plain, savoring the warmth. They weren't just breakfast. They were resourcefulness, turned golden in a pan. Cornmeal pancakes gave working men and hungry children the energy to face another day of labor or school. Each bite was familiar, sturdy, and deeply satisfying, a reminder that joy could still be found in thrift. No one had to go hungry so long as there was cornmeal in the barrel. These pancakes carried history in every crumb, the taste of endurance, the scent of home, and the memory of mornings that began with hope. Snow cream was winter's first dessert, made the moment fresh snow fell clean and white across farmhouse yards and fields. Children rushed outside with bowls and spoons, scooping pristine snow before it could be touched or walked upon. Mothers added cream, sugar, and vanilla, stirring quickly before the snow could melt completely. The result was something between ice cream and sorbet, light and fluffy with crystals dissolved instantly. Some families added maple syrup or honey instead of white sugar with variations that tasted like frozen forests. Others stirred in cocoa powder or berry preserves saved from summer. The dessert had to be eaten immediately, served in bowls at kitchen tables while wind howled outside. In Appalachian communities and northern farmsteads, snow cream meant celebration, turning brutal weather into joy. Families gathered around tables, laughing as they ate before the treat melted back to liquid. The tradition taught children that winter's harshness could provide pleasure. Modern health warnings about pollution have ended this practice, but for generations, snow cream was winter magic served cold. Children remember the excitement, the race to gather fresh powder before anyone walked through pristine whiteness covering farmhouse yards. Glazed ham studded with cloves and pineapple was the Christmas centerpiece that required hours of careful basting and patience. Whole bone-in hams were scored in diamond patterns, each intersection receiving a whole clove that would perfume the meat during cooking. Pineapple rings were pinned on with toothpicks, and maraschino cherries filled the centers, creating a retro but genuinely impressive appearance. The glaze combined brown sugar, mustard, and pineapple juice, brushed on repeatedly during roasting until it formed a mahogany coating that was simultaneously sweet, tangy, and slightly spicy. The meat underneath stayed moist and flavorful, the fat rendering into the glaze while the cloves infused subtle warmth throughout. In mid-century American homes, this ham represented prosperity and celebration, something families saved for Christmas Day when company would see and admire the presentation. Carving revealed pink meat glistening with glaze, and leftovers lasted for days, making sandwiches and casseroles. Today's simpler preparations miss the visual drama and layered flavors that made this ham unforgettable. Brown sugar-glazed carrots were the quiet stars of the holiday plate, simple but shimmering with sweetness. Peeled carrots boiled soft in salted water, then drained and tossed in butter until slick and golden. A scoop of brown sugar followed, melting into a sticky glaze that coated each slice like glass. The scent of caramel filled the kitchen, warm and buttery with a whisper of salt. Sometimes a drizzle of honey or a pinch of cinnamon joined in, deepening the flavor without stealing its simplicity. Children loved them for their sweetness, adults for their nostalgia. They gleamed under the dining room light, modest but proud, sitting between the grander dishes as a reminder that goodness did not need grandeur. They were affordable, humble, and always finished first. Grandmothers never called them fancy, but the way the sugar melted into the butter made them taste like love disguised as thrift. Canned Vienna sausage stew was the 1980s answer to dinner when the paycheck ran dry, but you still needed to feed everyone. Pop open a can of Vienna sausages, slice them up, and throw them into a pot with instant potatoes and green beans from another can. Let it all simmer in broth until the flavors came together, and you had a meal that felt bigger than it was. The sausages were soft, salty, and oily enough to add richness to the pot. It was a one-dish dinner that didn't need measuring cups or fresh anything. Moms across America called it Pantry stew, and it filled houses with that familiar smell of survival and ingenuity. You'd eat it with white bread to soak up the gravy, and for a few minutes, everyone forgot how tight money was. It was a recipe that belonged to those who refused to go hungry, even if all they had was a can and a stove. Navy bean soup was a soldier's meal brought home to the kitchen table. Beans, water, and patience, those were the essentials. A ham bone or scrap of salt pork, if available, turned the pot into something hearty and rich. The beans broke down slowly, thickening the broth until it was creamy and smooth. It was the definition of simple comfort, the kind of food that made a family feel safe on cold nights. Sometimes carrots or onions joined the mix, adding sweetness to the savory blend. A loaf of stale bread beside the bowl completed the meal. Navy bean soup was nourishment disguised as modesty. It filled stomachs, soothed worry, and brought families closer. It was the sound of bubbling pots and the smell of home during years when the world outside felt uncertain. Hominy was transformed winter corn, soaked in lye water until kernels swelled to twice their size and turned soft and tender. Whole dried corn was covered with water mixed with hardwood ashes with caustic solution that loosened tough hulls. After days of soaking and multiple rinses, the corn emerged pure white and dramatically changed, ready to be cooked as porridge or fried crispy. Farmhouse families ate hominy as breakfast cereal with butter and salt, as dinner side dish, or fried until golden as crispy cakes. In southern farmhouses with Native American and African influences, hominy represented traditional foodways preserved through generations. The preparation took time and attention, dangerous lye requiring careful handling. Women who made excellent hominy took pride in the results, perfectly white and tender. Native American techniques preserved through generations showed knowledge transfer across cultures, different peoples sharing food wisdom that helped everyone survive harsh continental winters together. Standing rib roast carved tableside was the Christmas centerpiece that required confidence and created genuine ceremony. The massive roast, several ribs thick and richly marbled, was seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and perhaps garlic before slow roasting in low ovens. The exterior developed a deep brown crust, while the interior stayed perfectly pink and juicy, the fat rendering and basting the meat throughout cooking. When brought to the table whole, the roast was impressive in size and aroma, filling the dining room with beefy richness. The father or grandfather would carve ceremonially, slicing thick pieces that revealed the rosy interior and fell apart with tenderness. Each guest received slices with crispy exterior fat and tender meat together. In prosperous post-war American homes, standing rib roast represented abundance and celebration, something families saved for Christmas when they wanted to show both hospitality and success. The bones were saved for soup, ensuring nothing was wasted. Modern preference for smaller cuts misses the drama and the communal satisfaction of presenting and carving this magnificent roast before gathered family. Sweet potato soufflé was dessert disguised as a side dish, a cloud of comfort rising from the oven. Whipped sweet potatoes met eggs, brown sugar, butter, and vanilla, beaten until smooth and poured into a glass dish. The top puffed gently as it baked, golden and trembling like a promise. Sometimes it wore a crown of marshmallows, other times a crumbly pecan topping, but always it brought warmth to the table. It was light enough to float, sweet enough to satisfy, and rich enough to feel like love made visible. Grandmothers took pride in their soufflés, folding in air with patience and prayer, watching it rise and hoping it would not fall before dinner. Every bite was memory, soft, spiced, and glowing with care. It was more than food. It was the essence of family gathered close, giving thanks with every mouthful. When it came to the table, heads turned and hearts softened. The first spoonful melted on the tongue, like autumn itself made edible. Even after the plates were cleared, its scent lingered, a whisper of warmth, a promise of return. Peanut butter bread pudding was the dessert you made when every sweet thing in the house was gone, but no one wanted to end dinner on an empty note. You'd tear up old bread, pour over a mix of milk, sugar, and a few spoonfuls of peanut butter, Then bake until the top turned golden and sticky. The smell filled the house like a warm blanket. It was thick, sweet, and rich enough to make you forget how cheap it was. No one wasted bread back then. It was too precious. If you had bananas or raisins, you could toss those in, but most times it was just bread, milk, and peanut butter working overtime. Families made it in square pans or cast iron skillets, serving it hot with a drizzle of syrup if they were lucky. It wasn't a fancy dessert, but it was one that made you close your eyes with that first bite. Peanut butter bread pudding was poor folks' decadence, a taste of comfort that didn't cost a dime extra. Vegetable loaf was the meatless miracle of the Depression years. Grated carrots, potatoes, onions, and whatever else the garden offered were mixed with breadcrumbs and eggs to hold them together. Baked until golden, it sliced like a roast and smelled just as comforting. Served with gravy or tomato sauce, it gave the illusion of plenty when meat was impossible to afford. Some families added beans or rice for heartiness, making it stretch even further. Every bite carried the taste of invention, a celebration of thrift that still managed to feel like abundance. Housewives called it Sunday supper without the cow, smiling as they lifted it from the oven, its crust browned and crisp at the edges. The aroma was home itself, savory, warm, and full of quiet pride. Children didn't miss meat when they had this on their plates. They saw a meal that looked special, tasted rich, and filled them completely. Sometimes it was baked in old coffee tins to make personal servings. Sometimes it was packed into loaves to last all week. Vegetable loaf was nourishment made from care and courage, a dish that transformed hardship into hospitality. It wasn't imitation. It was innovation, proof that satisfaction could bloom even in the poorest soil, one loaf at a time. Chicken and dumplings from old laying hens turned tough birds into tender winter suppers that fed families abundantly. When hens stopped laying in winter, they became dinner, boiled for hours until meat fell from bones. The rich broth was seasoned with vegetables and herbs, then dumplings were dropped in, simple dough that puffed up as it cooked, absorbing chicken flavor throughout. The finished dish was pure comfort: tender chicken, fluffy dumplings, and rich gravy ladled into deep bowls. Farm families ate this on Sunday evenings, gathered around tables after afternoon church. In rural communities nationwide, chicken and dumplings represented making use of what you had, old hens transformed through patience and technique. The long cooking required minimal attention, pots simmering while families did other work. Women's reputations rested partly on their dumpling texture, light but substantial. Children scraped bowls clean, sopping up every drop of gravy. Sunday dinner of chicken and dumplings meant the week had rhythm, that Sabbath brought rest and special food that honored tradition and gratitude for sustenance provided. Divinity candy made on humid-free days was the Christmas confection that tested both skill and patience while delivering pure sweetness. Sugar syrup was boiled to hardball stage, requiring precise temperature control and constant attention. Egg whites were beaten to stiff peaks separately. Then the hot syrup was slowly drizzled into them while beating continuously, creating a transformation from liquid to fluffy white candy. Vanilla and sometimes chopped nuts were folded in before the mixture was quickly dropped onto waxed paper in small mounds. The result was impossibly light, crispy on the outside but chewy inside, tasting like sweetened clouds with subtle vanilla depth. In Southern kitchens particularly, divinity represented holiday tradition and cooking mastery, something grandmothers made during cold, dry days when humidity would not ruin the texture. The candy was packed into tins and given as gifts or served from special dishes throughout the season. Modern candy makers rarely attempt divinity, intimidated by its requirements, but it once stood as proof of genuine kitchen skill and Christmas generosity. Cranberry relish mold shimmered like stained glass on the holiday table. Made from crushed cranberries, orange zest, sugar, and gelatin, it was the jewel among casseroles and gravies. Grandmothers poured it into ring molds, chilled it overnight, and unmolded it onto plates lined with lettuce leaves. It jiggled softly under the light, tart and refreshing against the heavier foods around it. Each bite was cool and bright, the tang of citrus cutting through the richness of the feast. It was the balance that Thanksgiving needed, the sparkle to the savory, the pop to the plain. Some versions added chopped walnuts or bits of pineapple, making it both textured and vibrant. Children loved to poke it with their forks just to see it wobble, while grown-ups savored its clean taste between bites of turkey and stuffing. Though time has moved on, the memory of that red, glimmering ring still lingers, its flavor as sharp and joyful as the laughter that once surrounded it. Powdered cheese rice came straight from the era of boxed dinners and instant fixes. When the macaroni ran out but that bright orange packet of cheese dust was still sitting in the box, you made do. You'd toss it into a pot of leftover rice with a splash of milk or margarine, stir until everything turned creamy, and serve it like it was gourmet. It was the taste of the 1980s on a budget. Salty, neon orange, and undeniably satisfying. Parents knew it would fill stomachs fast, and kids didn't know they were eating leftovers dressed up as something special. You could stretch one box of mac and cheese into 3 nights of dinners if you were smart about it. That glowing cheese powder had a power of its own. It made anything feel a little indulgent, even plain rice. Powdered cheese rice was comfort disguised as convenience, a hack born from necessity and nostalgia. Homemade applesauce was the taste of autumn preserved in jars. Families gathered around baskets of bruised or fallen apples, peeling and slicing them into big pots to simmer down with sugar, or often without it. The slow cooking turned the fruit into something golden and fragrant, filling the house with the scent of comfort. In lean years, every bit was used. Cores went to feed animals, skins became vinegar, and the sauce became sweetness for months ahead. Children licked spoons warm from the pot, and mothers sealed jars that would line pantry shelves like treasures. It wasn't just food, it was foresight. Applesauce appeared on breakfast tables, over biscuits, or beside savory dishes, reminding everyone that care and labor could turn even windfall apples into luxury. It was preservation at its finest, of fruit, of family, and of hope. Dried corn soup used summer's abundance to feed winter months, made from corn kernels dried on strings hung from rafters. Women cut kernels from fresh ears at peak ripeness, strung them like beads, and hung them to dry until they rattled like stones. In winter, handfuls of these kernels were soaked overnight, then simmered with ham hocks, potatoes, and milk until tender. The corn rehydrated into something richer than fresh, concentrated and almost sweet, thickening the soup naturally. Farm families ate this by the bowlful, often as a complete meal with cornbread on the side. In Pennsylvania, Dutch communities in the Northeast, dried corn soup represented wisdom and foresight. August's plenty transformed into February's sustenance. The preparation required planning months in advance, space in kitchens for hanging corn, and knowledge passed between generations. Children helped string kernels, learning preservation techniques that would sustain them later. The soup tasted distinctly different from fresh corn dishes, earthier and more complex. The soup's preparation was seasonal ritual, marking transition from fresh summer eating to preserved winter stores that sustained families through months of cold. Oyster stew on Christmas Eve was the elegant tradition that brought families together before midnight church services. Fresh oysters were gently heated in butter and milk until their edges just curled, then seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and sometimes a touch of celery salt or mace. The result was creamy, briny, and luxurious, tasting of the sea with rich dairy undertones. Served in fine china bowls with oyster crackers and sometimes a pat of butter floating on top, this was celebration food that felt special without being heavy. In coastal communities and inland cities alike, oyster stew represented Christmas Eve tradition from the 1920s through the 1960s, something families ate before attending services or after coming home from caroling. The preparation was quick but required attention, and the ingredients were expensive enough to feel indulgent. Children often received their first taste of oysters this way, learning to appreciate their delicate flavor. Today, it has largely disappeared, replaced by heavier meals, but it once defined Christmas Eve elegance. Corn pudding casserole was the soft golden heart of Southern Thanksgivings. It began with fresh corn shaved from the cob or a can opened with care, mixed with eggs, butter, milk, and a touch of sugar. The batter was poured into a greased dish and baked until it quivered like custard in the middle and browned just enough at the edges. It smelled like warmth itself, buttery, sweet, and faintly smoky if it caught just right in the oven. Grandmothers never measured, only stirred until it felt right. It was creamy enough to spoon, solid enough to slice, and so beloved that it rarely made it to leftovers. For families that knew how to make much from little, this dish was proof that simple ingredients could taste extraordinary. It was soft, rich, and humble, food that spoke of gratitude, patience, and love baked slow. The top gleamed like gold, and when the spoon broke through, steam rose like a sigh of relief. Each bite carried the sweetness of summer corn remembered in winter, the promise of sunlight reborn at the table. In its quiet way, corn pudding said everything, that love, when baked slowly, could feed both hunger and heart. Boiled hamburger gravy on bread was a working-class miracle that filled bellies and stretched a single pound of beef for days. Instead of frying the meat, folks would boil it in water until it crumbled into soft bits, then stir in flour and a little grease to make a thick, savory gravy. It wasn't pretty, but it smelled like home, and it soaked right through white bread like a promise. Some called it poor man's stew, others called it Tuesday dinner, but it was the same everywhere, simple, hearty, and cheap. It was the kind of meal you made when the fridge looked bare, yet somehow everyone left the table satisfied. The gravy clung to your fingers, the bread got soggy, and no one complained because it tasted like comfort. If you were lucky, you added pepper or onions, but even plain, it hit the spot. This was survival cooking that didn't apologize for itself, just warm, heavy food for long days and tired hearts. Fried apples and onions were the taste of resourcefulness and comfort combined. Thinly sliced apples and onions sizzled together in bacon grease until caramelized and tender. The result was sweet, savory, and smoky all at once, a dish that defied its simplicity. Served alongside bread or pork scraps, it filled the plate with warmth. The apples lent sweetness, the onions added depth, and the grease tied it all together with the flavor of home. It was the kind of food that made a little feel like a lot, transforming scraps into something memorable. Housewives cooked it slowly, stirring gently with wooden spoons while the air filled with its golden perfume. The crackle from the pan was the music of sustenance. Sometimes, families added a splash of vinegar or sprinkle of sugar to deepen the caramel flavor. Others ate it with biscuits, savoring the taste that balanced sweet and savory so perfectly it needed nothing else. Fried apples and onions turned humble ingredients into affection served hot. Long after the pan cooled, its scent lingered, comforting and familiar. It was a meal that proved poverty could still have poetry, that comfort could be coaxed from the simplest of means. Mincemeat made with venison preserved autumn hunting success through winter months, cooked with dried fruits, spices, and brandy into filling so rich a little went far. Fresh venison was ground or chopped fine, mixed with sweat, raisins, currants, apples, citrus peel, molasses, and warming spices, then packed into crocks where winter cold preserved it. Spoonfuls of this mixture filled pie crusts the season, baked until bubbling and served warm. The combination of meat and fruit seems strange today but was traditional, providing complete nutrition in concentrated form. Farmhouse families stored crocks of mincemeat in unheated pantries, knowing they had dessert available anytime. In areas where deer hunting was successful, mincemeat meant converting fresh meat into shelf-stable food that would feed the family for months. The preparation required significant work but produced something genuinely delicious. Complex flavors that developed over time. The complex spicing made mincemeat unique to each family. Recipes closely guarded and passed only to daughters who proved worthy of carrying culinary tradition forward properly. Sugar plums rolled by hand were the Christmas candy that required dedication and produced jewel-like confections. Dried fruits, including figs, dates, apricots, and prunes, were ground together with nuts, honey, and spices until they formed a sticky paste. Small portions were rolled into balls by hand, then coated in granulated sugar that sparkled like fresh snow. The candy needed no cooking, relying instead on the natural sweetness and binding properties of dried fruit and honey. The taste was intensely fruity and spiced, chewy and satisfying, with the sugar coating providing textural contrast. In Victorian and early 20th century Christmas celebrations, sugar plums represented the treats children dreamed about, the candies that danced in their heads according to famous poems. Making them was family activity, with everyone taking turns rolling balls and coating them in sugar. The candies stored well in tins and improved slightly with age as flavors melded. Modern versions are rare, but sugar plums once embodied Christmas sweetness and the magic of homemade confections created with care and imagination. Baked apples with cinnamon and raisins were dessert before pie became tradition. Apples were cored and stuffed with brown sugar, butter, and raisins, then baked until their skins split and their scent filled the house. The sauce at the bottom of the dish was gold. Caramel and spice melted together. Each apple collapsed into sweetness, spoon-tender and shining. Grandmothers made them for children and guests alike. Simple joy born from orchard fruit and pantry staples. It was the taste of warmth, of gratitude, of love served with a spoon. The air filled with cinnamon. The walls held the smell long after the meal was gone. Every bite was comfort, every serving a reminder that dessert did not need wealth, only imagination and care. It was sweetness earned by patience, humble and beautiful in its own quiet way. Each apple gleamed like a treasure, soft and fragrant, its juices catching the light in the baking dish. They were served steaming hot with a little cream or cold from the icebox the next day, both perfect in their own right. Even the simplest fruit became something sacred under such tender care, proof that the best flavors come from time, warmth, and love shared across generations. Instant coffee meat rub was one of those oddball ideas that somehow worked. You'd mix instant coffee crystals with sugar, salt, and a pinch of flour, rub it on cheap cuts of meat, and throw it in the oven or pan. The coffee acted like a smoky glaze, turning the outside dark and caramelized while hiding the fact that the meat was tough as rubber. It was a poor man's barbecue, full of flavor and pride. Families used it for pork, chicken, or whatever protein happened to be on sale. The smell filled the house like something from a steakhouse, and everyone gathered around pretending it was a special occasion. Even if the meat was chewy, no one complained. The magic of that bittersweet crust fooled everyone into believing it was better than it was. It was one of those small miracles from a time when making dinner meant making do. Cabbage and noodles was the meal that stretched a single vegetable into a family supper. The cabbage, sliced thin and simmered in a skillet with a little butter or fat, wilted into sweetness, wrapping each noodle in humble luxury. It was a dish borrowed from immigrant kitchens and adopted by Depression-era families across America, a meal that cost pennies but filled plates with warmth. Some added onions or breadcrumbs when they could, others stretched it further with bits of leftover potatoes or bacon grease for flavor. It was the sort of food that didn't need abundance. It needed ingenuity. Cabbage and noodles was soft, comforting, and nostalgic, the kind of food that carried the taste of endurance and care. It filled bellies, quieted worry, and made dinner feel like home, even when times were unforgiving. Families gathered around chipped bowls, grateful for something hot, and for a few moments the world outside the kitchen faded. Frozen custard pie was once a winter marvel turned icy temperatures into culinary advantage, baked in unheated back porches where nature provided perfect refrigeration. Farmhouse wives mixed eggs, cream, sugar, and vanilla into custard filling, poured it into pie shells, and set them outside on December mornings where temperatures between 20 and 32 degrees created texture no icebox could match. The custard froze and evenly, developing ice crystals so fine the result was creamy over icy, smooth rather than grainy. Families served these pies at Christmas dinners and New Year celebrations, cutting thick slices that melted on the tongue. The pies stayed frozen for weeks on screened porches, protected from animals but exposed to cold that preserved them naturally. Children watched eagerly as mothers checked the pies, pressing gently to test firmness. In rural Wisconsin, Minnesota, and North Dakota, the 1800s and early 1900s, frozen custard pie represented winter abundance as cold weather could create luxury. The tradition faded as electric freezers arrived, but those who tasted these natural frozen desserts never forgot their delicate texture and pure flavor. Those who remember speak of textures impossible to recreate. Winter's gift transformed into silk. Crown roast of pork decorated with paper frills was the showstopper centerpiece that made Christmas dinner feel truly spectacular. Butchers prepared these special roasts by tying pork rib sections into circles, creating natural crowns that stood upright on platters. The center was stuffed with bread dressing mixed with sausage, apples, and herbs, while the roast itself was rubbed with garlic, salt, and pepper before slow roasting until golden brown. Paper frills were placed on each rib bone before serving, creating a festive appearance that drew gasps when the roast arrived at the table. The meat was tender and juicy, the stuffing absorbed porky juices, and the presentation was genuinely impressive. In mid-century American homes, crown roast represented prosperity and celebration, something families ordered specially and served with pride. The carving was ceremonial, each person receiving ribs and stuffing together. Today's simpler roasts cannot match the drama and elegance, though the preparation required skill and confidence that modern cooks often lack. Giblet gravy was the truest act of Thanksgiving patience. Made from the bird's neck, heart, and gizzard, it simmered slowly in a pot beside the roasting pan, filling the kitchen with the deep, savory scent of effort rewarded. The giblets were chopped fine, folded into thickened broth, and seasoned with black pepper and love. It was a recipe learned by sight, not by book. When the spoon coated the back just so, it was done. Grandmothers ladled it over dressing, potatoes, or biscuits, knowing it could turn even dry turkey into comfort. It was the taste of respect for every part of the bird, of gratitude that nothing was wasted. Rich, smooth, and soulful, giblet gravy wasn't just a condiment. It was Thanksgiving's heartbeat, the flavor that tied every dish together. The pot simmered all morning, quietly transforming scraps into silk. Each spoonful carried the story of hands that refused to waste, of cooks who believed flavor was earned through time. Even when the table fell silent, the warmth of that gravy spoke for everyone. Ketchup and egg scramble was born in kitchens where groceries ran out faster than the week. You would crack 2 eggs into a pan, squeeze a generous squiggle of ketchup, and mix until everything turned pink and sizzly. The ketchup added color, tang, and a sweetness that made even the thinnest batch of eggs taste like more than it was. It stretched the meal, gave it life, and added a hint of something bright in a time when flavor usually meant salt. Parents swore by it, especially when breakfast needed to feed more mouths than there were eggs to go around. Kids loved it because it looked fun, like someone had drawn with crayons on their breakfast plate. The smell of sizzling ketchup filled tiny kitchens across the country, turning cheap mornings into something memorable. It was quick, warm, and didn't leave you hungry. For many families, it wasn't just food, it was a little lesson in making do, in turning scarcity into something that still made you smile before heading out into the day. Bread pudding with milk and cinnamon was comfort born from frugality. Stale bread soaked in milk, sweetened with whatever syrup or sugar could be spared, and baked until puffed and golden. The result was warm, soft, and fragrant, a dessert that turned hardship into home. Cinnamon and nutmeg, if available, added the smell of luxury to kitchens that knew very little of it. Families gathered around the oven, drawn by the scent of sweetness rare in hard times. No one cared that the bread was old or that the milk was thin. It was proof that even the most ordinary ingredients could become extraordinary with care. Housewives poured the mixture into dented pans, often using the same ones their mothers had used before them. As it baked, the top turned crisp and golden, the edges caramelizing just enough to make each bite feel like celebration. It was often shared after Sunday supper or brought to neighbors as a gesture of kindness. Leftovers, if there were any, were eaten cold the next morning. The flavor deepened overnight. Bread pudding was the humble dessert that made kitchens feel alive again, its sweetness cutting through the bitterness of want. It was love, baked golden. Suet pudding was dense winter fuel, steamed for hours in cloth bags hung over kettles on wood stoves. Beef suet, the hard fat surrounding kidneys, was chopped fine and mixed with flour, dried fruit, molasses, and spices. The mixture was packed into floured cloths, tied tight, and suspended in boiling water until firm. After 3 or 4 hours, the pudding emerged solid and heavy, sliced thick and served hot with cream or hard sauce made from butter and sugar. The suet provided concentrated calories essential for surviving winter, each slice delivering lasting energy. In British immigrant communities' America's farmlands, suet pudding connected families to ancestral traditions while adapting to available ingredients. Women competed over whose pudding was lightest despite its density, whose spices were most balanced. The dessert appeared at Christmas dinners and winter celebrations, its richness marking special occasions. Children anticipated these puddings for weeks, knowing the dried fruits inside were rare treats during lean months. The tradition required patience and skill, careful timing, and temperature control. Christmas preparations began with suet pudding days early, the house filling with spice-scented steam that promised celebration abundance. Buttercream frosted Yule log cakes were the Christmas dessert that required artistry and delivered woodland magic. Chocolate or vanilla sponge cake was baked thin, spread with buttercream or jam, then rolled into logs while still warm. Once cooled, the logs were frosted with chocolate buttercream textured with forks to resemble tree bark. Meringue mushrooms, marzipan holly, and powdered sugar snow completed the forest scene. The cake was light and creamy, the roll creating spirals when sliced that were beautiful and delicious. In French traditions adopted by American families, the Yule log represented ancient celebrations where actual logs were burned for luck. Making these cakes became a holiday ritual, with mothers teaching daughters how to roll without cracking. The finished logs were centerpieces on dessert tables, too pretty to cut, but too delicious to save. Today's simpler cakes miss the craftsmanship and imagination that made Yule logs genuine works of edible art representing Christmas magic. Mock cherry pie was invention baked into beauty, born from times when cherries were rare or too costly. Cranberries and raisins took their place, stewed with sugar and lemon until they glistened red like jewels. The filling was tart and deep, its texture thick and glossy, clinging to the fork with substance. Grandmothers called it mock, but there was nothing false about its comfort. The scent of spice and fruit filled the air as it baked, wrapping the home in warmth that money could not buy. The crust was flaky, sometimes brushed with milk or sprinkled with sugar for shine. When sliced, it oozed like memory, tangy, sweet, and utterly familiar. It was a dessert that proved resourcefulness could taste just as rich as luxury. Each forkful carried quiet pride, a testament to women who made plenty from little and never let scarcity dim celebration. The bright red filling shimmered under lamplight, a reflection of ingenuity and endurance. Served warm with cream, it felt like abundance reborn, proof that joy was never measured in cost but in care. Fried bologna chips were genius, born out of boredom and thrift. You took a slice of bologna, cut it into quarters, and tossed it into a hot skillet until it curled up like bacon and popped around the edges. The smell alone could pull anyone to the kitchen. The sizzling sound was pure comfort, like something important was happening on the stove. A paper towel would soak up the grease, and before long, you'd be snacking on salty, crispy bites that tasted like meat candy. It was perfect for game nights, cheap beer, or payday eves when you wanted something crunchy without opening a bag of chips. Some folks dipped them in mustard, others stacked them between white bread with a smear of mayo. It wasn't fancy, it was food that did its job. Fried bologna chips were the working-class answer to bacon, proof that good flavor didn't need a big budget. It was something to look forward to after a long week, and in its own greasy way, it made life taste a little better. Mock apple pie, sometimes called cracker pie, was the dessert that fooled even the sharpest tongues. Made from crushed crackers, sugar syrup, and a splash of lemon, it baked up golden, tender, and tasting surprisingly like apples. It was culinary sleight of hand, resourcefulness disguised as indulgence. Housewives took pride in serving it, smiling as guests guessed its secret. During the Depression and wartime rationing, real fruit was too costly or unavailable, but this pie brought sweetness back to the table. Cinnamon and nutmeg hid the truth even better, giving the illusion of abundance where there was none. It was more than a trick. It was triumph through creativity. Mothers whispered its secret to daughters like a treasured spell of survival. The sound of crust crackling under the knife felt like victory itself. Each slice reminded families that imagination could fill the gaps left by scarcity. Even the name, mock, became a badge of pride, not shame, a declaration that dignity could thrive in deprivation. Children grew up remembering the pie's sweetness, not its deception. In truth, it was no imitation at all. It was invention. Mock apple pie proved that in kitchens where dreams outnumbered ingredients, love could taste like luxury. Salt pork and cabbage stew filled farmhouse kettles January and February, when fresh meat was scarce and gardens lay buried. Thick slabs of salt pork, preserved in barrels since autumn butchering, were cut into chunks and rendered slowly until fat ran clear and meat turned golden. Cabbage heads stored in root cellars joined the pot, cut into wedges softened for hours. Potatoes, onions, and sometimes turnips added substance, while the pork fat created richness that coated everything. The stew simmered on wood stoves from morning until supper time, filling houses with savory steam. Families ate it with cornbread or biscuits, sopping up the salty broth that provided essential calories for outdoor winter work. In farmhouses across the Midwest and Northeast, this stew represented survival cuisine, stretching preserved meat to feed large families through the coldest months. The salt pork's intense flavor meant a little went far, as it economical as well as nourishing. Children grew up associating this stew with deep snow and howling winds, comfort food that warmed from the inside. The tradition faded as refrigeration made fresh meat available year-round. Grandmothers who made this knew precisely how much salt pork created richness without overwhelming cabbage's natural sweetness throughout long simmering. Chicken a la king, served in pastry shells, was the elegant Christmas luncheon dish that transformed leftovers into luxury. Diced chicken was combined with mushrooms, pimientos, and sometimes green peppers in a rich cream sauce thickened with egg yolks and sherry. The mixture was heated gently to avoid curdling, creating something velvety and sophisticated. Spooned into baked puff pastry shells or over toast points, it represented refined dining and proper entertaining. In tea rooms and home kitchens during the 1940s through 1960s, chicken a la king appeared at ladies' Christmas luncheons and bridge club gatherings, showing that leftover turkey or chicken could become something genuinely impressive. The preparation required skill with sauce making and attention to temperature, but the result was always creamy, flavorful, and satisfying. Families often made it on December 26th using Christmas turkey, extending the holiday meal into something that felt fresh and special. Modern versions with canned soup cannot match the silky texture and complex flavor of properly made a la king with real cream and careful technique. Tomato aspic was elegance preserved in gelatin, the kind of dish that told guests you had class and patience. It began with tomato juice simmered with vinegar, lemon, and a dash of Worcestershire, poured through a sieve to catch every seed and skin. Then came the gelatin, melted and stirred until the mixture thickened, glossy and fragrant with spice. Chopped celery or olives might be folded in before it was poured into a ring mold and chilled overnight. In the morning, it emerged firm and shining, a crimson wreath that glowed like stained glass. Some grandmothers served it with a dollop of mayonnaise or a scatter of parsley. Others kept it plain, proud of its smooth perfection. It was cool, savory, and slightly tangy, a salad dressed in dignity. The first slice wobbled but held its shape, releasing the memory of a world that valued care in presentation as much as taste. Tomato aspic may seem strange now, but once it was the height of refinement, proof that creativity could make even tomatoes feel like a celebration. Oatmeal patties came from mornings when waste was unthinkable and every leftover had a second act. Cold oatmeal from breakfast would be mixed with an egg, maybe some flour, and fried up like pancakes in a sizzling pan. They crisped on the outside and stayed soft in the middle, smelling faintly of cinnamon or whatever sugar you'd stirred in before. It was the kind of breakfast that made sense in tight times. You already had it, so why not make it better? You could spread a little syrup on top or just eat it plain, standing at the stove with the spatula still in your hand. Kids didn't complain. They thought it was new, not recycled. Families who grew up poor never forgot oatmeal patties because they represented something special, making the most of what was left. Even when money got better, you'd find people still frying them up out of habit. The golden edges, the smell of butter, the sizzle, it was breakfast reborn. Dandelion greens with vinegar were the salad of survival. Foraged from fields, vacant lots, or even backyard corners, these greens turned necessity into nourishment. Washed carefully and tossed with a splash of vinegar, they brought sharpness and color to plates heavy with starch. A bit of bacon grease or onion added flavor when available. They were bitter, yes, but honest, alive, and full of strength. Families learned to see food not just in what was bought, but in what was found. Dandelion greens carried the flavor of the land and the dignity of self-reliance. They symbolized both struggle and triumph, reminding people that sustenance could be found anywhere if one was willing to look closely enough. Mock apple pie made from crackers fooled nobody but tasted good. Depression-era innovation that created fruit pie flavor from Ritz crackers and lemon juice. The crackers were broken into pie crust, covered with syrup made from sugar, water, cream of tartar, and lemon, then baked until bubbling. The result did taste surprisingly like apple pie, the crackers softening into something fruit-like while spices provided familiar flavor. Farmhouse families made this during winter when preserved apples ran out but craving for pie remained. The recipe represented American ingenuity and the willingness to create pleasure from whatever was available. Depression-era necessity became family story told with mixture of pride and humor, as how hardship created ingenuity that sometimes succeeded in creating pleasure from pantry basics when nothing else remained. Hard sauce made with real butter and brandy was the crowning glory served atop plum puddings and mince pies throughout the holiday season. Butter was creamed until fluffy and white, then beaten with powdered sugar and generous amounts of brandy or rum until it formed a smooth, boozy spread. The sauce was shaped into decorative molds or simply formed into logs, then chilled until firm and sliced at serving time. The flavor was intensely buttery with sweet alcohol bite, melting immediately when placed on hot pudding and soaking into every crevice. In Victorian and early American kitchens, hard sauce represented sophistication and proper Christmas preparation, something made ahead and stored in the icebox for weeks. Families often had special molds shaped like holly leaves or Christmas symbols for forming the sauce. The ritual of making it was passed from mothers to daughters, with each family adjusting the brandy-to-butter ratio to personal preference. Modern desserts rarely feature this accompaniment, but it once transformed simple puddings into something genuinely luxurious and memorable. Mincemeat pie was a relic of old-world comfort, dense with fruit, spice, and memory. Dried apples, raisins, currants, and citrus peel mingled with warm cinnamon, nutmeg, and the richness of suet. The filling was sticky, dark, and glistening, a taste of history on a fork. Grandmothers simmered it for hours before spooning it into flaky crusts, sealing the edges with a press of their fingers. When it baked, the scent of cloves filled the whole house, mingling with the hum of conversation. Every slice was a reminder of winters gone by, of holidays when sugar was scarce and flavor was treasure. Some families used a splash of apple cider or brandy, others just a little molasses to deepen the color. It was heavy with comfort, and lightened by memory. When served warm with a scoop of ice cream or a dollop of whipped cream, it turned into something transcendent, old-fashioned joy that tasted like time itself. Mincemeat pie was not flashy, but it was loyal. A dish that returned year after year, bringing with it the old songs, old stories, and the sweetness of survival. Biscuit dough pizza boats turned canned biscuits into dinner for a crowd. You'd flatten each one into a little bowl, spoon on tomato sauce from a jar, sprinkle shredded cheese, and maybe add a slice of pepperoni if you were feeling fancy. Pop them in the oven and watch as they puffed and browned, smelling like pizza night on a dime. Kids loved them because they were small enough to hold, and parents loved them because they cost next to nothing. They looked cute, tasted amazing, and disappeared before they even cooled. It was the kind of meal you could make out of leftovers and pantry scraps without needing a recipe card. The 1980s were full of little tricks like this, turning store-brand dough and canned goods into a moment of joy. Biscuit dough pizza boats weren't just food, they were a celebration of what imagination could do on a shoestring budget. Fried cornmeal mush was yesterday's breakfast, turned into today's treat. Once the leftover mush cooled, it was sliced and fried until golden, the outside crisp and the inside soft. It was cheap, easy, and beloved, proof that nothing ever truly went to waste. For many families, it was eaten with syrup or even a sprinkle of sugar when available, a small sweetness earned through thrift. It smelled faintly of roasted corn, like warmth made edible. Children loved the crunch, adults loved the satisfaction, and everyone loved how far it could stretch. In lean years, fried cornmeal mush became both a meal and a lesson. It taught gratitude, patience, and ingenuity. Every slice was a testament to the art of making do, of turning leftovers into joy. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect, the kind of food that kept America strong when the pantry was weak. Head cheese wasn't cheese at all, but jellied meat from hog heads, made during winter butchering when cold weather preserved everything. After autumn hog killing, heads were boiled for hours until meat fell from bone and liquid turned gelatinous from natural collagen. The meat was chopped, seasoned with vinegar, pepper, and herbs, then poured into pans where winter cold set it firm. The result was sliceable loaves with meat suspended in clear jelly, eaten cold with bread and mustard. In German and Eastern European farmhouse communities, head cheese represented thrift. Using parts would otherwise be wasted. Families stored the loaves in unheated pantries where they stayed fresh for weeks. The texture was unique, tender meat in firm jelly that melted slightly at room temperature. Some cooks added pickles or onions to the mixture with variations that reflected family preference. Head cheese appeared at winter breakfasts and lunches, providing protein when other meat was being rationed for future meals. The tradition taught that nothing from the hog should be discarded, that skill could transform scraps into delicacy. Skilled butchers took pride in their head cheese, knowing proper seasoning and perfect gel distinguished excellent cooks from merely competent ones' communities. Cheese ball towers were monuments of the 1980s holiday pride, standing tall in shimmering pyramids of cream cheese, herbs, and chopped nuts. Every family had their secret mix: cheddar, pimento, or maybe a hint of Worcestershire, rolled by hand and dusted with parsley until they gleamed like edible ornaments. They sat proudly in the middle of buffet tables, surrounded by buttery crackers, celery sticks, and laughter that carried from room to room. Guests would chip away at them through the night, reshaping the tower until it looked like a melted snowman of cheese and memory. The clink of cocktail glasses, the glow of tinsel, the hum of Bing Crosby on vinyl. These were the sounds that went with every bite. The cheese ball tower was never about fancy ingredients. It was about the ritual of gathering, of making something by hand and watching it disappear as conversations warmed. It was creamy, crumbly, and nostalgic in every sense. By the end of the night, only crumbs and a few broken crackers remained, proof that it had done its job. A 1980s Christmas party was not complete without it. A glittering tower of comfort, joy, and unapologetic excess, sitting proudly beside the punch bowl like an edible memory of merrier times. Oven-baked candied yams were the dessert disguised as a side dish, a golden, bubbling pan of sweetness that smelled like comfort itself. Peeled sweet potatoes were sliced thick, arranged neatly, and covered in a rich syrup of brown sugar, butter, and a touch of cinnamon. As they baked, the syrup thickened into caramel, soaking into every piece until they glowed amber under the oven light. Near the end, marshmallows were scattered across the top and left to melt into soft clouds of golden cream. Children watched from the kitchen doorway, waiting for the moment the top turned brown and sticky. The smell alone could bring everyone to the table before the turkey was carved. It was sugary, tender, and warm, proof that sweetness could come from soil and patience. Grandmothers made them every year without fail, knowing they were more than food. They were tradition itself, shining beneath the holiday lights. Each bite tasted of gratitude, of comfort earned, of generations gathered in one spoonful. The syrup clung to spoons and lips, a sweetness that refused to fade. The dish came out bubbling, alive with sugar and love, its glow as much a memory as a flavor. Mayonnaise and tomato saltines were what passed for luxury when the lights were dim and the pantry looked bare. You'd take a sleeve of saltines, smear each one with a bit of mayonnaise, then press on a slice of tomato fresh from a neighbor's garden or the grocery discount bin, sprinkle a little salt, maybe pepper if you had it, and you were set. Folks called them poor man's canapés, but they tasted like victory after a long day. It was the kind of snack you made barefoot at the kitchen counter with a glass of sweet tea sweating beside you. Kids thought it looked strange, but always came back for another bite because it hit that perfect balance between creamy, salty, and sharp. You could find families across the South and Midwest doing the same thing late at night, catching reruns on television with a paper towel full of saltines in hand. There was no need for fine dining or silver spoons, just a little mayonnaise, a ripe tomato, and something cold to drink. It wasn't just a snack. It was a reminder that the simplest things could feel fancy when you needed them to. Homemade dumplings in broth turned scarcity into warmth. A few scoops of flour, water, and a pinch of salt were all it took to create fluffy morsels of comfort. Dropped into simmering broth, they puffed up and soaked in the flavor like little sponges of hope. The broth might be vegetable-based or made from leftover bones, but it was always rich in spirit. This dish stretched the smallest ingredients into something generous, a meal that filled stomachs and hearts alike. Families would gather close around the pot, watching the dumplings rise, steam fogging the windows as laughter filled the kitchen. When money ran low, these dumplings were currency in themselves, soft, satisfying, and full of love. Homemade dumplings in broth was not just food, it was care made tangible, spoonful after spoonful. Rabbit pot pie used winter-caught rabbits in deep dish pies that fed entire families from limited meat. Rabbits trapped in snowy fields were cleaned, jointed, and simmered until tender. The meat pulled from bones and mixed with potatoes, onions, and carrots. This filling went into deep pie dishes, covered with pastry crust, and baked until golden. The crust absorbed rich gravy while staying flaky on top with texture contrast that made every bite interesting. Farm families served these pies as Sunday dinners, stretching 1 or 2 rabbits to feed 8 or more people. In rural communities, the Northeast and Midwest, rabbit pot pie represented resourceful cooking, turning small game into substantial meals. The pastry added calories that vegetables and lean rabbit meat couldn't provide alone. Women competed over whose crust was lightest, whose gravy most flavorful. Children anticipated these pies eagerly, knowing rabbit meant a special meal. Women who mastered rabbit pot pie could feed families from little, stretching 1 rabbit into 8 servings through clever use of vegetables and perfect pastry. Baked Alaska flamed tableside was the dramatic Christmas dessert that combined ice cream, cake, and meringue into a theatrical dining experience. Sponge cake was cut into rounds and soaked with liqueur, then topped with brick ice cream that had been shaped and frozen rock hard. The entire construction was covered in thick meringue that was quickly browned under the broiler or with a blowtorch, creating insulation that protected the ice cream while the exterior caramelized. At the table, brandy was poured over and ignited, sending blue flames dancing across the white surface. The contrast of temperatures was shocking and delicious. Hot meringue giving way to cold ice cream with tender cake underneath. In fancy restaurants and ambitious home kitchens during the 1950s and 1960s, baked Alaska represented the pinnacle of dessert showmanship, something that required timing, confidence, and theatrical flair. Families remembered these desserts for decades, the drama making the occasion unforgettable. Today's simpler desserts cannot match the spectacle or the satisfying complexity. Celery root and apple slaw was the crisp, clean side that brought freshness to the table. Shredded celery root met tart apple, tossed in a dressing of vinegar, mustard, and a hint of sugar. The crunch was perfect, the flavor sharp and cool against heavier dishes. It was rustic but refined, proof that even the simplest produce could feel special. Grandmothers made it with care, balancing each flavor until harmony was achieved. It was the taste of simplicity done right, honest, bright, and full of quiet grace. Some versions used sour cream or mayonnaise for creaminess, others left it clear and sharp. Served cold, it refreshed the tongue between bites of stuffing and gravy, a hidden gem amid the feast. It reminded everyone that freshness had a place beside tradition, that even amid abundance, balance mattered. Every bite carried a whisper of the harvest, the tang of fall air, and the lightness that heavy meals craved. The bowl gleamed with pale greens and whites, a humble beauty beside golden casseroles and roasts. It was the unsung hero of Thanksgiving, crisp, clean, and quietly unforgettable. Johnny cakes from Rhode Island tradition traveled west with migrants, cornmeal griddle cakes that were breakfast staple in farmhouse kitchens. White cornmeal was mixed with boiling water, salt, and sometimes milk with thick batter that cooked on hot griddles greased with pork fat. The cakes developed crispy edges centers, served hot with butter and molasses or maple syrup. These cakes cooked quickly enough for fresh breakfast every morning, requiring minimal ingredients families always kept. In farmhouses America, Johnny cakes connected people to colonial foodways, Native American corn preparation adapted by European settlers. The name itself sparked debate, some claiming it was journey cake for travelers, others insisting on Shawnee cake. Children loved these cakes, eating them folded around butter that melted into the hot cornmeal. Morning ritual of Johnny cakes connected generations, children learning by watching mothers and grandmothers cook, absorbing technique through observation rather than written recipes or formal instruction. Persimmon pudding made from wild fruit was the Christmas dessert that connected families to the land and seasonal rhythms. Wild persimmons gathered after the first frost were pressed through sieves to create smooth pulp. Mixed with flour, sugar, eggs, milk, and spices, the batter was baked slowly until it formed a dense, dark pudding with custard-like texture. The flavor was unique and almost tropical, sweet with slight astringency that made it interesting rather than cloying. Served warm with hard sauce or whipped cream, persimmon pudding represented regional tradition, particularly in the Midwest and South, where wild persimmon trees grew abundantly. Gathering the fruit was family activity, with children climbing trees and adults catching fruit in sheets. The pudding appeared only at Christmas, making it special and anticipated. Modern grocery stores rarely carry persimmons, and the wild variety is nearly forgotten. But this pudding once stood as proof that nature provided abundance for those who knew when and where to look. Lima bean casserole was quiet strength disguised as supper, the kind of dish that fed body and heart. Cooked lima beans baked in cream sauce with bits of onion and a topping of crushed crackers browned to perfection. The flavor was mellow, buttery, and slightly nutty, with a texture that melted against the tongue. It was warmth in its purest form, simple, filling, and made with love. Grandmothers baked it in Pyrex dishes, the edges bubbling while the top turned crisp and golden. Children might wrinkle their noses at first, but one bite changed everything. It was food that held its own among fancier dishes, unassuming yet unforgettable. Lima bean casserole was comfort measured not in cost, but in care, proof that humble ingredients could hold extraordinary tenderness. The cream thickened just enough to coat every bean, creating a softness that calmed the soul. Each spoonful was steady, soothing, and kind. food that healed as much as it fed. Oatmeal bread was the loaf that sustained a nation through its hardest years. When white flour was scarce or too costly, oats filled the gap. Cooked with water, molasses, and a bit of yeast, the dough baked into dense, hearty slices that kept hunger at bay. The smell alone was enough to lift spirits, a sweet, nutty scent that filled the home like a promise. Spread with a little butter or dipped into stew, it turned the simplest meal into something special. It stored well, stayed moist, and stretched far, making it a staple for families who had little but hope. Mothers would bake several loaves at once, stacking them on windowsills to cool, their golden crusts gleaming in the afternoon light. Even when there wasn't enough to go around, there was always bread, shared, broken, and passed between hands like communion. Oatmeal bread was more than a recipe. It was ritual, a weekly act of perseverance. The first slice out of the oven was often eaten hot, steam rising like gratitude. It was food that carried meaning beyond sustenance, each loaf a small declaration that hunger would not have the final word. Oatmeal bread was stability baked fresh, a humble masterpiece of endurance. Turnip and potato mash combined two root cellar staples into side dish that stretched limited supplies. Turnips and potatoes were boiled together until soft, mashed with butter and milk until creamy, seasoned with salt and pepper. The turnips added slight bitterness that balanced potatoes' blandness with more interesting flavor than either alone. Farmhouse families ate this alongside meat or as main dish when meat was scarce, the combination providing nutrition and satisfaction. In communities where potatoes dominated winter meals, turnips provided variety while remaining economical. Economic necessity created this combination initially, but cooks discovered that limitations often produced better results than abundance, forcing creativity that improved flavor rather than merely economizing on ingredients. Wassail bowl served hot with floating apples was the Christmas punch that welcomed guests with warmth and spiced tradition. Apple cider was heated with cinnamon sticks, cloves, allspice, and sometimes orange peel, creating an aromatic base. Sugar and sometimes eggs were added for richness, while ale or wine provided boozy depth. Small apples or apple slices floated on top, bobbing like ornaments in the steaming liquid. The taste was sweet, spicy, and warming, with layered flavors that developed as the wassail sat on the stove throughout Christmas parties. In English and American traditions from medieval times through the mid-20th century, wassail represented hospitality and celebration, offered from large bowls with a ladle for serving. The ritual of wassailing included toasting to health and prosperity, making the drink about community as much as flavor. Families kept special bowls just for wassail, ornate pieces that came out once yearly. Modern hot apple cider cannot match the complexity or the ceremonial importance that wassail once carried at Christmas gatherings. Celery stuffed with pimento cheese was crisp, cool, and quietly sophisticated in its simplicity. It was always there on the relish tray, lined up beside pickles and olives, waiting for guests to arrive. The celery snapped bright and green, while the cheese, sharp, creamy, and orange as sunset, filled each groove perfectly. Pimento cheese was made by hand in those days, grated cheddar mixed with mayonnaise and chopped peppers until it spread smooth. It was humble food turned handsome, a bite-sized bridge between generations. Children reached for it first, then the grown-ups followed, laughing at how something so plain could taste so right. It was the flavor of Southern hospitality. No fuss, no waste, just care and balance. Stuffed celery may have faded from modern tables, but in memory it still crunches fresh, reminding us that the smallest things often hold the most heart. On trays wrapped in plastic or set on crystal dishes, it shone bright and proud. It was the appetizer that started conversations and the taste that lingered long after. A single bite could summon whole holidays, laughter, chatter, and the kindness that began every gathering. Red pepper winter cabbage fry was the kind of dish that came from gardens long gone quiet under frost, but still managed to show up on the table through planning and memory. Families saved dried red peppers from the warmer months, stringing them up in kitchens where they hung like little sparks waiting for their season to return. When winter settled in and vegetables became scarce, cabbage stayed dependable, sturdy, and patient in the root cellar. Grandma sliced it into shreds, heated bacon grease or whatever fat was left, and tossed it with crushed dried pepper until the pan hissed and filled the kitchen with warmth. The red pepper did not just add heat. It added life, a reminder of summer sun even when the wind howled outside. This dish was quick, cheap, and filling, which made it perfect for families trying to stretch the days between grocery trips. You could feed a whole table with one head of cabbage and a handful of peppers, and no one complained because the flavor was loud enough to make you forget how simple the ingredients were. This was winter survival dressed up as comfort, built on the knowledge that nothing should go to waste, and everything could become a meal if you treated it right. And when the plate hit the table, steaming and bright with specks of red, it tasted like determination warmed in a skillet. Carrot croquettes turned the simplest vegetable into a feast. Mashed carrots, breadcrumbs, and a pinch of seasoning were formed into little patties and fried until brown and crisp. They were sweet, soft inside, and hearty enough to stand as a main dish. The smell of frying croquettes filled the kitchen with quiet joy, a reminder that warmth and comfort could still be coaxed from scarcity. During the Depression, they were prized for being colorful and nourishing, proof that even modest meals could bring delight when made with care. Housewives often used saved bacon grease or a spoonful of drippings to fry them, infusing each bite with a rich, smoky edge. The outside crisped to a golden brown, the inside meltingly soft, balancing sweet and savory in every mouthful. Some cooks added mashed potatoes or flour to stretch the mix further, while others relied solely on carrots from their gardens. They looked cheerful on the plate, like bits of sunshine pulled from the earth, served beside cabbage or bread. Children who had grown tired of plain boiled vegetables suddenly found joy in their new form. Carrot croquettes showed that nourishment was not just about survival, it was about creativity, care, and pride in creating something beautiful from so little. Ambrosia made from scratch with fresh coconut was the Christmas fruit salad that required genuine effort and produced spectacular results. Families bought whole coconuts, cracked them open, and painstakingly shredded the white meat by hand or with special graters. Fresh oranges were supremely segmented, removing every bit of membrane to leave only jewel-like fruit pieces. Pineapple was cubed, maraschino cherries were drained, and miniature marshmallows were added for sweetness and texture. The mixture was folded together gently and chilled overnight, allowing flavors to meld while the coconut softened slightly. The result was fresh, sweet, and tropical, tasting like sunshine during winter darkness. In Southern homes particularly, ambrosia represented Christmas morning tradition, something served at breakfast or alongside the main meal. The name meant food of the gods, and families took pride in their versions, adjusting fruit ratios and sometimes adding pecans or whipped cream. Modern versions use pre-shredded coconut and canned fruit, losing the textural contrast and fresh flavor that made the original so special and memorable. Jell-O salad with cottage cheese was the bright, jiggling joy of mid-century Thanksgivings. It shone in every shade, lime, strawberry, or orange, layered with whipped topping, crushed pineapple, and soft curds of cottage cheese. To modernize, it might seem strange, but to those who grew up with it, it was a treat of elegance and creativity. Grandmothers poured it into ring molds and let it chill overnight, pulling it out like a gem the next day. The first slice always got a laugh. The second got silence as sweetness met cream. It was cool, tangy, and full of nostalgia, the edible memory of post-war optimism, of women proud to make beauty from boxes and cans. Jell-O salad was more than a side dish. It was art in pastel form, a symbol of home, pride, and the charm of doing your best with what you had. Each wobble reflected the effort and pride that built every meal from the ground up. It tasted of sugar, fruit, and hope, the sweetness of an era that believed anything could be made brighter with color and care. Oatmeal porridge with syrup drizzle was the breakfast that wrapped hunger in warmth. Cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable, it was the anchor of many Depression-era mornings. A handful of oats simmered slowly in water or milk, thickened into something hearty enough to keep workers full until noon. For families lucky enough to have molasses, honey, or syrup, a drizzle turned the plain bowl into comfort itself. It was quiet, reliable, and full of love. A mother's way of saying, "We'll be all right," without words. Children learned to appreciate its simplicity, and adults found solace in its familiarity. Oatmeal porridge was more than food. It was a ritual, a gentle beginning in a world that often felt uncertain. Steam rose from chipped bowls as the day began, carrying the smell of survival and sweetness in equal measure. It was the taste of endurance softened by a spoonful of hope. Persimmon pudding used wild fruit that ripened after hard frost, when freezing temperatures sweetened bitter fruit into delicacy. Wild persimmons were gathered from trees on farmhouse property, the fruit pressed through sieves to make smooth pulp. This pulp was mixed with flour, eggs, milk, spices, and molasses, poured into pans, and baked into dense, dark pudding. The result tasted like concentrated autumn, sweet and complex with hints of caramel. Farmhouse families served this at Thanksgiving and Christmas, wild fruit transformed into celebration dessert. In southern and midwestern communities where persimmon trees grew, this pudding represented seasonal bounty, free food that required only labor to gather. The fruit had to be perfectly ripe, rock soft after frost, or the pudding would be astringent. Regional pride attached to persimmon pudding, each area claiming their recipe was authentic, their technique correct, their pudding the real version that honored tradition and completely. Fruitcake soaked in brandy for months was the Christmas tradition that divided families but represented serious baking dedication. Dried fruits were soaked in brandy overnight before being mixed with flour, eggs, butter, molasses, and elaborate spice blends. The batter was packed into pans lined with parchment and baked slowly at low temperature until dark and fragrant. Once cooled, the cakes were wrapped in brandy-soaked cheesecloth and stored in tins, with more brandy added weekly. By Christmas, they were moist, boozy, and incredibly dense, tasting of concentrated fruit and spice with serious alcohol undertones. In proper households, fruitcakes were made in November or even October, the aging process considered essential to achieving proper flavor and texture. They were sliced thin and served with tea or after dinner, meant to be savored slowly rather than devoured. Today's mass-produced versions cannot match the depth or the ritual of homemade fruitcake aged properly with quality ingredients and genuine patience. Giblet stuffing bread pudding was thrift turned into triumph. Leftover bread, torn by hand, soaked in broth, and mixed with chopped giblets, onions, and herbs until rich and savory. It baked dense and golden, crisp at the edges, and tender in the middle. The smell was pure nostalgia, poultry, butter, and thyme. This was the dish that proved nothing was wasted, that flavor could come from the humblest parts. Every bite told of resourcefulness, of making do and making it good. It was hearty, generous, and full of quiet pride. The gravy clung to it perfectly, soaking into its soft heart while the crust stayed crisp. Families learned patience from dishes like this and gratitude too. In every kitchen where it was made, it said the same thing without words, that waste was shame and care was abundance. Cabbage soup with barley was the poor man's feast, a meal that offered strength without extravagance. A single cabbage, chopped and simmered with barley, onion, and salt, became a pot large enough to feed an entire family. The barley thickened the broth, giving it the body of a stew, while the cabbage softened into silky ribbons. It smelled of home, of something hearty and whole. Sometimes a leftover bone was added for depth, but even without, it filled bellies and quieted hunger. Each spoonful carried a reminder that comfort didn't depend on meat, it depended on care. Housewives often simmered it all day, letting the scent fill their small kitchens while children played nearby. The bubbling pot meant warmth was coming. No matter how meager the pantry looked, it was a dish that turned worry into patience, and patience into nourishment. Even when ingredients were rationed or borrowed from a neighbor, cabbage soup found a way to make a little stretch a long way. In those days, one pot of soup could mean another week of survival, another night of peace. Families sat shoulder to shoulder at wooden tables, ladling out seconds with laughter that cost nothing. Cabbage soup with barley was more than food. It was community in liquid form, a taste of resilience in its purest expression. Scrapple stretched winter pork supplies by combining meat scraps with cornmeal into breakfast loaves fed families for weeks. After hog butchering, every scrap of meat, organ, and trimming went into huge kettles with water and seasonings, boiling until everything fell apart. The liquid was strained, meat chopped fine, and returned to broth with cornmeal that thickened the mixture into mush. This was poured into loaf pans, cooled until firm, then sliced and fried until crispy. Each slice delivered concentrated pork flavor, the cornmeal adding substance that made little meat go far. In Pennsylvania farmhouses and German communities, scrapple was winter breakfast tradition, served with eggs and fried apples. The preparation took entire days but produced enough loaves to last through the coldest months. Families stored scrapple in cold pantries where it stayed fresh without refrigeration. Children grew up with its distinctive taste, learning that nothing should be wasted when resources were limited. Each family's scrapple recipe was slightly different, with neighborhood pride and friendly competition over whose loaves had best flavor texture for frying. Floating island dessert served in crystal bowls was the Christmas finale that combined elegance with theatrical presentation. Custard sauce was prepared carefully, tempering eggs with hot milk until it thickened into smooth crème anglaise. Separately, egg whites were beaten with sugar until stiff, shaped into large meringue islands, and poached gently in simmering milk. The pillowy meringues were placed atop the cold custard just before serving, floating like snowy clouds on golden sea. Sometimes caramel was drizzled over for color and flavor contrast. The dessert was light yet rich, the textures completely different between creamy custard and airy meringue. In French-influenced American dining during the mid-20th century, floating island represented sophistication and proper technique. The presentation in glass bowls showed off the beautiful layers. Families served these at Christmas dinner when they wanted to impress guests while offering something less heavy than cake. Today's simpler puddings miss the visual drama and refined technique that made floating island genuinely memorable and special. Turkey giblet loaf was the heart of thrift and love, wrapped into one humble dish. Leftover turkey meat, minced giblets, breadcrumbs, and eggs came together into a loaf that baked firm and fragrant. It was simple food, dense with flavor and meaning, stretching what was left into another meal for hungry mouths. Grandmothers mixed it by hand, trusting feel over measurement, shaping it smooth before setting it to bake in a greased pan. The smell that rose from the oven was savory and grounding, meat, herbs, and warmth filling every corner. Served with gravy or sliced cold for sandwiches, it carried the memory of holiday abundance into the days after. It was practicality turned tender, every slice a reminder that care could transform scraps into comfort. Each loaf was a lesson in gratitude, that nothing was wasted, and everything had worth when touched by love. The edges browned just right, and when sliced, the loaf revealed its heart, soft, rich, and seasoned with perseverance. It was a dinner that lingered, proof that even the humble could be holy. Potato peel chips were the triumph of thrift. Waste turned wonder. When every scrap counted, even the skins of potatoes became treats. Peeled thick and fried crisp in leftover fat, they bubbled and browned into golden ribbons. Sprinkled with a pinch of salt, they crackled between the teeth, tasting richer than their humble beginnings. Children loved them. Adults marveled at how good resourcefulness could taste. Nothing was discarded. Everything had purpose. Housewives saved peelings in bowls throughout the week, determined not to waste a thing. On Fridays, the pans came out, and the sizzle of frying skins filled kitchens with joy. The smell was irresistible, earthy, toasty, and indulgent in its simplicity. These chips were more than food. They were a gesture of defiance against scarcity. Served in paper cones or chipped bowls, they brought laughter to tables where there had been worry. For a moment, the world felt abundant again. Potato peel chips were not just crispy snacks. They were proof that even scraps could hold comfort, that hunger could be met with ingenuity, and that sometimes the smallest things could taste like victory. Pork and beans baked in crocks became Saturday night tradition farmhouse America. Dried beans and salt pork transformed through long, slow cooking. Navy beans soaked overnight were layered with chunks of salt pork, onions, molasses, and mustard in earthenware crocks, covered and baked in low ovens for 8 hours or more. The beans absorbed pork fat and molasses, turning creamy inside while developing caramelized crust on top. Families ate these with brown bread, coleslaw, and pickles. The traditional Saturday supper before Sunday's cooking was forbidden. In New England farmhouses, baked beans represented Puritan tradition adapted to American ingredients. African, Native American, and European foodways merged. The preparation required planning, soaking beans Friday night, and starting cooking Saturday morning. Children loved the sweet, savory flavor, scraping stuck bits from crock edges. Saturday nights meant baked beans inevitably, the smell announcing weekend's arrival, promising rest and simple, abundant food after weeks' hard labor on New England farmhouses everywhere. Peppermint ice cream made in hand-crank freezers was the Christmas dessert that required family teamwork and delivered seasonal perfection. Custard base was prepared on the stove with eggs, cream, milk, and sugar, then cooled completely before peppermint extract and crushed candy canes were stirred in. The mixture was poured into the metal canister of an ice cream freezer surrounded by ice and rock salt. Then someone began the long process of cranking the handle. Children took turns, their arms growing tired as the mixture thickened and resistance increased. When finally frozen, the ice cream was pink-tinted, intensely minty, and studded with candy pieces that provided crunch. The flavor was refreshing yet creamy, tasting exactly like Christmas in frozen form. In families throughout the 1950s and 1960s, making peppermint ice cream was holiday tradition that brought everyone together, creating memories as much as dessert. The hand-cranked texture was distinctive, smoother than modern commercial versions. Today's convenience cannot match the satisfaction and the anticipation that came from making ice cream together as family activity on Christmas Day. Ambrosia salad was sunshine in a bowl, sweet and simple as childhood. Canned fruit cocktail, shredded coconut, and whipped cream were folded together with care, then chilled until soft and cool. It was dessert pretending to be a side dish, and no one complained. The colors gleamed, orange, pink, white, like confetti and cream. Grandmothers served it with pride, knowing it would disappear faster than anything else. Each spoonful tasted of celebration, of simpler joys and sweeter days. Ambrosia was the bridge between generations, proof that comfort could come from a can if seasoned with love. Some added mini marshmallows for extra sweetness. Others stirred in cherries or pecans to make it fancy. It was the one dish that children could make without help, and they did, giggling while sneaking bites from the bowl. It was the sweetness after the storm of dishes and chatter, the final sigh of contentment after the feast. Corn and bean succotash was a dish born from Native American tradition and carried forward through generations of thrift. Sweet corn and tender beans simmered together in a pan of butter or drippings until creamy and fragrant. Sometimes a splash of milk or bits of salt pork were added, if fortune allowed. The combination was perfect, simple, filling, and full of life. In the Depression years, succotash became a symbol of gratitude, showing that two humble ingredients could come together to make something whole. It was bright on the plate and rich in memory, a taste of the land and its generosity. Housewives knew how to make a pot stretch for days, reheating it with rice or adding broth to create something new each time. It was a dish that tied the old to the new, native roots to southern kitchens, poverty to pride. Succotash carried a whisper of abundance even when times were harsh. Children would scoop it up with bread, leaving their plates spotless. It reminded families that simplicity didn't mean surrender. It meant survival. Each spoonful was nourishment and nostalgia, proof that gratitude was a meal in itself. Sauerkraut with pork and dumplings combined fermented cabbage with winter meat in one-pot meals that sustained farmhouse families through blizzards. Sauerkraut made in autumn from garden cabbages was pulled from crocks, rinsed and simmered with pork ribs or shoulder until meat turned tender. Dumplings made from flour, eggs, and milk were dropped into the bubbling liquid, puffing up as they cooked. The result was tangy, rich, and deeply satisfying, the sauerkraut's acid cutting through pork fat while dumplings absorbed all the flavors. Families ate this in large portions, refilling bowls until the pot was empty. In German and Polish farmhouse communities, this dish represented cultural memory and practical nutrition, fermented vegetables providing vitamins when fresh produce was unavailable. The preparation required advanced work as sauerkraut in fall for winter use. Women took pride in their kraut's flavor, the perfect balance between salt and tang. The overnight fermentation of sauerkraut created beneficial bacteria that aided digestion and provided vitamins, making this dish delicious and healthy winter food. Syllabub whipped with sherry and cream was the Christmas dessert drink that blurred the line between beverage and pudding. Heavy cream was whipped with sweet sherry or Madeira, sugar, lemon juice, and sometimes beaten egg whites until it formed soft, billowy foam. The mixture was spooned into glasses and chilled, settling into layers with frothy top and slightly liquid bottom. The taste was boozy, creamy, and citrus bright, something between eggnog and whipped cream with sophisticated wine undertones. In colonial and Victorian Christmas celebrations, syllabub represented elegance and proper entertaining, something served from punch bowls or special syllabub glasses at holiday gatherings. The preparation was simple but required quality ingredients and proper technique to achieve the right texture. Children received versions made with milk and minimal alcohol, while adults enjoyed the full-strength creation. Modern desserts rarely combine wine and cream this way, but syllabub once stood as essential Christmas tradition, proving that simple combinations executed well-created genuine luxury and memorable flavor. Oyster dressing was the taste of tradition meeting the tide. It began with breadcrumbs softened in broth, folded together with chopped celery, onion, butter, and those unmistakable oysters, briny, soft, and rich with the flavor of the sea. For families living along the coast, it was not just a dish, but a symbol of home and harvest. Grandmothers shucked fresh oysters when they could, but canned ones worked just as well when times were lean. The smell of butter and salt filled the kitchen as the pan baked, turning golden on top and tender underneath. Every bite brought a mix of comfort and ocean air, the land and the water meeting in one spoonful. It was old-fashioned, yes, but not outdated, the kind of food that carried memory in every taste. On Thanksgiving, when the turkey rested and the table filled, oyster dressing was a quiet reminder of roots and resourcefulness. It was a coastal heirloom, passed from mother to daughter, served with pride and gratitude for what the earth and sea could still give. Vegetable fritters were the sound of sizzling hope. Bits of grated carrots, potatoes, or corn were bound together in batter and fried until crisp and golden. The smell alone could draw children to the kitchen door. They were eaten plain or with a dab of syrup, turning scraps into celebration. Nothing fancy, just the rhythm of oil popping and the satisfaction of knowing the family would eat well that night. These fritters made vegetables exciting again, especially when meat was rare. The crisp edges and soft centers spoke of clever hands and warm kitchens. They weren't just food, they were ingenuity in motion, one panful at a time. Housewives worked quickly over the stove, flipping each fritter by hand, their aprons dusted with flour and pride. The oil shimmered, hissing as batter met heat, a song of sustenance that filled every corner of the home. In the leanest winters, fritters became a favorite because they made something from nearly nothing, a handful of leftovers transformed into joy. Every bite crackled with the story of resourcefulness. Vegetable fritters were more than a dish. They were proof that hope could still be fried up golden, even in the darkest days. Corn pone fried in bacon grease turned cornmeal into crispy cakes that accompanied every winter meal. Coarse cornmeal was mixed with boiling water and salt, formed into thick patties, and fried in rendered bacon fat until the outside turned crackling crisp. The interior stayed soft and dense, the bacon fat providing richness that plain cornmeal lacked. These pones appeared at breakfast with eggs, at dinner alongside beans or greens, and at supper with whatever meat was available. In Southern and Appalachian farmhouses, corn pone was daily bread, cheaper than wheat flour and equally filling. Children ate them hot from the skillet, burning their fingers and not caring. The preparation was quick enough to do fresh for each meal, requiring only 3 ingredients families always had. Mothers fried dozens at a time, feeding large families economically. The tradition connected people to their cornmeal-based heritage, African and Native American foodways adapted to American farmhouse life. 3 ingredients and skilled hands created food that sustained millions, as excellence required technique over expense, wisdom rather than wealth in farmhouse kitchens. Mincemeat pie with real sweet and brandy was the Christmas dessert that took weeks to prepare and lasted through the entire season. Families started in November, chopping dried fruits, apples, raisins, and citrus peel, then mixing them with actual beef sweet, spices, molasses, and generous amounts of brandy or rum. The mixture was packed into stone crocks and left to age, the flavors melding and intensifying as the alcohol preserved everything. By Christmas, the mincemeat was dark, rich, and incredibly complex, tasting of cinnamon, cloves, citrus, and deep boozy sweetness. Baked in flaky pastry crusts, these pies were dense and substantial, meant to be served in small slices with hard sauce or whipped cream. In Victorian homes and early 20th century kitchens, mincemeat pie represented tradition and abundance, something you made once and enjoyed for weeks. The preparation was ritualistic, often done by grandmothers who guarded their recipes and aging techniques. Modern versions with no meat or alcohol cannot touch the depth of the original. Jellied cranberry sauce in its homemade form was the holiday jewel before cans took over. Fresh cranberries boiled with sugar and orange peel until they popped, their tartness turning to a ruby sweetness that caught the light. The warm syrup was poured into ring molds, chilled overnight, and released with a glossy shine. Each slice held its shape but quivered with life, tart and bright enough to cut through the heaviest meal. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a labor of patience, love, and tradition. Every grandmother had her secret ratio of sugar to berries, each believing hers struck the perfect balance. Homemade jellied cranberry sauce was more than garnish. It was artistry and memory combined, a crimson echo of a time when effort was its own reward. Some families added crushed pineapple or a hint of clove, turning a side dish into signature history. It wasn't just food, it was a tradition set in ruby glass, alive with every slice. Baked carrots with molasses were nature's candy for lean times. When sugar was rationed and dessert a rare dream, carrots stepped in with quiet sweetness. Peeled and roasted until tender, then brushed with molasses, they turned glossy and golden in the oven's heat. The flavor was earthy and deep, with caramel notes that lingered long after the meal. Some cooks added a dash of cinnamon or a sprinkle of salt to balance the richness. Served beside potatoes or bread, they felt almost indulgent, a little burst of brightness in gray days. Baked carrots with molasses taught a lesson that sweetness was not just found in sugar. It could be coaxed from the earth, from patience, from resourcefulness. It was dessert in disguise, a humble nod to the creativity that defined an era of making do. Crackling cornbread incorporated crispy pork skin bits throughout, adding richness to otherwise plain bread. Cracklings left from rendering lard were chopped and stirred into cornbread batter before baking with bread, with pockets of crispy, fatty pork throughout. The result was more substantial than plain cornbread, the pork fat making it tender while cracklings added texture. Farmhouse families ate this with beans, greens, or soups, the bread rich enough to serve as meals protein. In southern farmhouses, crackling cornbread represented thrift and flavor, using byproducts that enhanced rather than detracted. The cracklings distributed created pockets of flavor that made each bite slightly different, turning simple cornbread into something exciting that kept children asking for more portions. Spring roll cookies pressed with carved molds were the anise-flavored Christmas tradition that turned cookie making into folk art. The dough was simple but precise, requiring beaten eggs, sugar, and flour in exact proportions, then flavored heavily with anise oil or extract. Once mixed, the dough was rolled smooth and pressed with intricate wooden molds carved with Christmas scenes, animals, flowers, or religious imagery. Each cookie carried detailed impressions that would remain through baking. The cookies were left to dry overnight before baking at low temperature, creating a distinctive white appearance and rock-hard texture when fresh. Stored in tins with anise seeds, they slowly softened into tender cookies with intense licorice flavor that either enchanted or repelled. In German and Swiss communities, spring roll represented heritage and artistry, with antique molds passed through generations. The preparation required time and proper technique, making these cookies about tradition more than convenience. Today, they remain niche specialties, but they once adorned Christmas tables across European American households every December. Potato rolls with honey butter were softness reborn from leftovers. Mashed potatoes folded into dough made each roll impossibly light, moist, and tender. The dough was worked gently, risen twice, and brushed with melted butter until the tops shone. When baked, they filled the home with the smell of warmth, a mixture of yeast, sweetness, and love. The honey butter melted into the rolls, glistening in the cracks as families reached for seconds before the first basket was empty. Grandmothers made them by memory, kneading until the dough felt right. It was thrift transformed into grace, the proof that yesterday's leftovers could become tomorrow's blessing. Each bite was soft, sweet, and fleeting, yet the memory of it lasted long after the meal was gone. These rolls carried the rhythm of care: rise, rest, bake, serve, the steady heartbeat of home kitchens. When spread with honey butter that melted into every pore, they tasted like comfort itself, sweetened by time and touch. Potato and onion soup was the quiet miracle of hard times, thin, humble, and endlessly comforting. A single potato or two, an onion, a pinch of salt, and water were all most families could spare. But somehow, that was enough. The onions browned in a pan until sweet, the potatoes broke down into tender softness, and what came together wasn't just soup, it was survival. During the Great Depression, this was dinner for many, a meal that warmed both hands and hearts. It filled the air with a smell that whispered of endurance, even when the cupboards were bare. Sometimes milk or butter was added if luck or kindness made them available. Other times it was just broth and faith. Still, each bowl reminded people that flavor didn't depend on wealth. It came from care, patience, and the will to make something from nearly nothing. Potato and onion soup was the taste of perseverance itself, a dish that proved comfort could be coaxed from the simplest of ingredients and the hardest of days. Salsify oyster stew used garden roots that looked like dirty white carrots but tasted surprisingly like oysters. This odd vegetable, grown in kitchen gardens and harvested after first frost, was peeled, sliced, and simmered in milk with butter, onions, and seasonings until tender. The result tasted remarkably like oyster stew, providing coastal flavor to landlocked farmhouses. Families who couldn't afford or access real oysters made this dish for special occasions, serving it at Christmas dinners and New Year celebrations. In farmhouses, the Midwest and Great Plains, salsify stew represented culinary cleverness with luxury from backyard gardens. The vegetable stored well in root cellars, staying fresh through winter. Children were often tricked into eating it, told they were having oyster stew and believing it because the taste was so convincing. The tradition showed how flavor could be achieved through unexpected means. The resemblance fooled guests who thought they tasted real oysters, creating delight when trick was revealed, and proving farmhouse gardens held surprising treasures for those who knew. Taco salad trifle was the ultimate 1980s showpiece. Layers of lettuce, spiced beef, cheese, salsa, and crushed Doritos stacked in a glass bowl like edible confetti. It was part meal, part decoration, and fully beloved. Every layer told a story of color and crunch, a fusion of convenience and creativity. The Doritos gave it a neon orange glow that fit the decade perfectly. People admired it before eating it, marveling at its brightness. The first scoop was always a little chaotic, but that was part of the fun. It wasn't about precision. It was about plenty. This dish embodied the optimism of its era: fun, fearless, and a little loud. The crunch of chips, the spice of taco meat, the cool tang of sour cream, it was impossible not to smile. Taco salad trifle wasn't subtle, but neither was the 1980s. It was the taste of joy layered high. Apple raisin bread stuffing was autumn folded into a bowl. The sweetness of fruit, the scent of spice, and the heartiness of bread all mingled into one. Cubes of stale loaf soaked up butter and broth, while diced apples and plump raisins added contrast and cheer. The mixture was seasoned with sage and nutmeg, sometimes a hint of clove, and baked until golden and fragrant. Each forkful was soft, slightly crisp at the edges, sweet yet savory. It was food that carried warmth and memory, reminding every table of harvests and hearths. Grandmothers made it when they wanted something both thrifty and festive, a recipe that stretched what they had into something worthy of gratitude. It was stuffing that told a story of resourcefulness and celebration at once. Simple ingredients raised to their highest calling by patience, love, and an oven glowing steady through the afternoon. Crisco toast was the kind of breakfast you made when payday was still a few sleeps away and you were down to the last loaf of bread. You would take a knife, scoop out a chunk of white shortening, and spread it over a slice of bread like it was the finest butter in the world. Sometimes, if you wanted to treat yourself, you would sprinkle sugar for sweetness or salt for that perfect bite of grease and crunch. The heat from the toaster would melt the Crisco into the bread, giving it that familiar shimmer that made it look richer than it was. Families made it before heading off to work or school, and no one ever complained because it was warm, filling, and reliable. There was something oddly comforting about it too. The simplicity, the smell, and the reminder that you could still make something from nothing. Crisco toast was proof that even when the cupboards were bare, you could still sit down to something that felt like breakfast, even if it was just illusion wrapped in nostalgia. Rice and raisin pudding was yesterday's rice reborn as dessert. Nothing fancy, just rice, milk, a handful of raisins, and a touch of sugar or syrup when possible. It was baked until golden, the raisins plumping in the heat and perfuming the kitchen with sweetness. The texture was soft and creamy, with a faint chew that lingered between spoonfuls. In hard times, it was a luxury made from leftovers, proving that satisfaction didn't depend on abundance. Families ate it warm after supper or cold the next morning for breakfast. Children loved its quiet sweetness. Adults loved that it cost almost nothing. The pudding turned frugality into comfort, waste into pleasure. Every dish was scraped clean, every raisin savored. Rice and raisin pudding was proof that the best desserts were born from gratitude, not plenty. Smoked sausage made during winter butchering preserved pork through smoking that added flavor while preventing spoilage. Ground pork was mixed with spices, stuffed into casings, and hung in smokehouses where hardwood fires burned for days. The smoke penetrated the meat with distinctive taste and forming protective coating. These sausages hung in cold storage winter, sliced as needed for meals. Farmhouse families ate smoked sausage fried for breakfast, simmered with sauerkraut for dinner, or sliced cold for sandwiches. The preparation required knowledge of meat handling, spice ratios, and smoking techniques passed through generations. Different woods created different flavors. Hickory most common, but apple and cherry prized. Pride in homemade sausage was justified, the smoking process requiring attention and skill that distinguished true farmers from those who merely kept animals without understanding full use of resources. Which of these forgotten recipes would you bring back to your kitchen? Drop your answer in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe so we can keep saving these incredible flavors before they disappear for good.